Computer. All right, go.
Good day, everyone. My name is Gordon Stanger, and I'm going to talk today about the disastrously false dichotomy surrounding evolution. What is the most divisive global issue in Christianity today? Is it Protestantism versus Catholicism versus Eastern Orthodoxy? No. Is it pro-life versus abortion? No. Is it women priests or sexual abuse by the clergy? No. Globally, the most divisive issue within the church is interpretation of scripture, either as literal inerrancy or as complex Hebrew literature, mostly literal, but in places metaphor, numerical symbolism, poetry or other vivid imagery, parable, allegory, and other literary idioms. Nowhere is this discussion more vexing than in our understanding of the first few chapters of Genesis. Passionate views, one side or the other, have given rise to a large portion of Christendom finding itself profoundly conflicting with science, and most notably over whether evolution is true or not. Just to be clear, and so that you understand where I'm coming from, my perspective is that of my being both a Christian and an earth scientist, both for more than half a century. I am emphatically certain that there is no genuine conflict. This is not a scientific problem. It is 100% a theological problem. Science and Christianity should not be enemies, but unfortunately, fundamentalist, creationist belief has created a false construct. I quote directly from anti-evolution sources. Evolution was invented to kill the God of the Bible, so they say. Evolution would love to strip scripture of its veracity. Evolution is not science, but merely a secular philosophy. Theistic evolutionists are not truly committed to Jesus and don't trust the Bible. By the way, that's an accusation that I personally find particularly egregious. To continue these quotations, you must choose between evolution or the Bible. You must choose between God-hating evolutionists or God himself. You must choose between Darwin or Jesus. These are not my words. These are not anomalies from maverick commentators. These are often repeated dogma taught in fundamentalist churches, universities and seminaries, primarily in America, but in other places as well. In arguing all 7 of these statements, creationists have not researched adequately. They have not practiced balanced and considered assessment. To put it frankly, all 7 of the above statements, and many others that I could have quoted, are simply untrue. Evolution is theologically impartial. It stands on the evidence, not on some anti-God conspiratorial theory. Evolution wasn't invented to promote a malign purpose. It is the inescapable conclusion drawn from careful observation and unbiased logical deduction. Some churches actually teach that rejecting evolution is necessary to follow Jesus. I wonder how many thousands have failed to gain God's kingdom because of this insistence. Indeed, even some Christian evangelists have tragically abandoned their faith because they could not reconcile scientific reality with this false teaching. These evolution denialists have many names, from young Earth creationists or simply creationists to fundamentalists, intelligent design advocates, etc. No bucket term is strictly correct. So for want of a better name, I will simply use the term creationists, whilst recognizing that there are a handful of old Earth creationists. Well, I semantically group all shades of anti-evolutionists with the same brush because they're all essentially coming from a modern rather than an ancient Hebrew understanding of Scripture. I contend that creationist argumentation is not against real scientific evolution, but more against an anti-Christian travesty of evolution and so-called evolutionists. They do not accept the huge body of scientific evidence which verifies evolution, and even vilify those, like myself, who accept its demonstrable reality. I quote, for example, the late Henry Morris, one of the most prominent creationist proponents. The so-called geologic ages are essentially synonymous with the evolutionary theory of origins. The latter is the anti-God conspiracy of Satan himself. Well, I would prefer to discuss the real issue, which is how to interpret the first few chapters of Genesis. But since creationists themselves insist upon basing their case from their perception of science, well, okay, I accept the challenge. So here are some of the real scientific evidence and arguments. Basically, is there any compelling reason to believe evolution? Yes, there is. The first one is precise microfossil zonation. Microfossil zonation is something you benefit from every time you put petrol in your car. The marine microfossils I refer to are the foraminifera, single-celled calcareous critters which have been around for at least 500 million years and which exist across the oceans in incredible numbers. As far as we know, there are only 40 living species of foraminifera, but there have been at least 4,000 species in the past. The precise evolutionary sequence of foraminiferal species in strata spanning more than 200 million years is the basis of petroleum exploration. This slide shows the age range of the 10 main evolutionary stages, with the number of subspecies in brackets. The 10 foraminiferal zones I present here are merely a simplification of the zones commonly used in hydrocarbon exploration. There are many more zones, and the evolutionary succession extends to both much earlier and to the present time. Whenever an oil well is drilled, cuttings at each depth of penetration are examined under a microscope. The microfossils tell the geologist exactly where he or she is in relation to possible oil-bearing strata. Without an evolutionary succession of microfossils, the geologist is drilling blind, and the success rate in finding oil would be greatly reduced, which would end up doubling or tripling the cost of exploration and the price of your petrol. The church, not far from where I live, once put up a public notice on the main road proclaiming, "You are not a monkey's uncle." They held a special meeting to bash evolution, which I attended. I pointed out the evidence of microfossil zonation over an immense thickness of marine sediments, in which the ultra-precise order of fossiliferous strata was always the same. It doesn't matter where you look. You can examine the strata from Morocco, Algeria, Italy, Greece, Hungary, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Oman, or Yemen. You can examine these strata from anywhere in these in this Paleotethys ocean, as you see on this slide. This is a reconstruction of the continental configuration before recent continental drift. The microfossils in this Tethyan ocean are similar looking, but distinctly evolved. The microfossils invariably occur in exactly the same evolutionary sequence. There is no explanation for such a precise and consistent sequence except for evolution. Prominent creationists have argued that all of these foraminifera were naturally sorted as they sank through the turbid, sediment-filled ocean during Noah's flood. They attempt to explain this by varying densities of the microfossils, or by differences in hydrodynamic properties, or some combination of the two. Such supposed counter-arguments are no explanation at all. They don't go into any detail, and when one examines the detail, they instantly collapse upon close examination. There is no explanation other than evolution. After I explained this, I remember watching the creationist I was talking to. He was screwing up his face in denial, going through mental gymnastics, trying to think of some valid creationist alternative explanation. There wasn't one. A second reason to invest in evolution is that it provides such a reliable foundation for much of science. Rational evolutionary progression isn't merely confined to microfossils, it's across the entire fossil record, micro and macrofossils. The geological column makes eminently good sense. There are well in excess of 250,000 fossil species which have been scientifically described. A very small number are oddities in which there is insufficient data to classify them exactly. And for a small number, their age is imprecisely known. And there are still some small gaps in the time series, but they're very small, and as time goes by, these gaps are closing. Overall, the vast majority of all fossil species fall into a complex but rational evolutionary succession. It all makes eminently good sense. The National Center for Science Education in California put it this way: the fossil record not only documents evolution, but the very existence of the fossil record was the force that drove unwilling scientists to admit, nearly 2 centuries ago, that living forms had changed. That is, they evolved. I would also add that many of these pioneering geologists were themselves Christians. Some were even ministers in the Church of Scotland who set out to prove recent creation, and they couldn't. Evolution is the foundation of modern biology. As Sir Peter Medawar once famously said, with evolution, everything in geology and biology makes sense. Without evolution, none of it makes any sense at all. This slide is somewhat stylized. It's a cladistic diagram of primates. And you've probably all seen cladistic diagrams, or cladograms as they are known. They are graphical relationships depicting the order in which evolutionary branching or divergence occurred. Many cladograms were developed on morphologic grounds long before they were verified by fossil anatomy or by genetic analysis. A third reason to believe in evolution is the consistent parallel between genetic divergence and cladistic divergence. The tree of life is the complex scheme of evolutionary progression, which has led to the incredible proliferation of species that we see alive today, well over 5 million species. And if we categorize all the microbes, then there are quite possibly around 1 trillion species. The popular image of the tree of life was established on morphological grounds, well before there was any capability for comprehensive genetic analysis. As of 2021, there are roughly 4,000 species whose genome has been sequenced, of which several hundred are of reference quality, telomere to telomere. Now, I should just explain, telomeres are the molecular knots at each end of a double helix molecule, and it's these which stop the DNA from unraveling. So when we're talking about telomere to telomere, we're talking about high fidelity sequencing with 99.99% accuracy of the entire genome, including all the redundant junk DNA. And note that a large amount of genetic variation can be found in the dispensable genome, the junk DNA. The result is complete and precise validation of the previously deduced evolutionary scheme. The further a species is from humanity, the less genes we have in common. This slide illustrates just a handful of examples. If there was no evolution, then how could this cladistic genetic relationship be explained? Homologous structures in the fossil record, the fourth reason to believe in evolution. Structural similarities inversely proportional to evolutionary divergence occur, as we have seen in this slide. I think the slide speaks for itself. Homologous structures are so common and distributed over so many groups of related organisms as to indicate an obvious commonality of origin. Evolution tinkers with whatever forebears are available, even if they're not ideally suited to new environmental pressures and functions. A fifth reason to validate and believe in evolution is that of evolutionary history influencing later embryonic development. Just to clarify two terms here, ontogeny is the growth and development of an individual organism. Phylogeny is the growth and development of a species or a phylum. The outdated but famous phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was coined by Ernest Haeckel back in 1866, just a few years after Darwin's Origin of Species. We now know that is not entirely true, but it's not entirely false either. It's close enough for there to be no doubt that the growth of an organism is a complex pathway largely determined by its past evolutionary history. And we can argue a little bit about exactly how this occurred. Von Beer's explanation, the diagram as in this slide, is an improvement on Haeckel. Perhaps a better way to put it is that related organisms start with a common generic as a general embryonic form and then eventually diverge into distinct adult morphologies as they complete their development. Ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny, but ontogeny and phylogeny are nevertheless deeply intertwined. Some examples include slits in early fetal development of humans and many other species which resemble evolutionary forerunners. Another example, baleen whales initially develop teeth and then reabsorb them. Third example, all multicellular animals make use during ontogeny of a unique set of 180 DNA base pairs called the homeobox, always in the same order through 800 million years of evolution. Vestigial organs. These are leftovers from evolutionary precursors. As an organism evolves to new circumstances, new habitats, or a new ecological niche, it is common for previously necessary organs to regress to non-functional purposes. Some examples include vestigial hip bones in whales, a throwback to 40 million years of evolution. Leg bones in snakes, vestigial wings in cormorants and penguins, a vestigial tailbone, the coccyx, in humans, and countless other examples. There are even vestigial organs in some plants, such as functionless stipules and carpels. In humans, other examples include wisdom teeth and the appendix, which are best explained as evolutionary leftovers from when proto-humans ate a predominantly leaf-based diet. Vestigial organs only make sense if evolution has occurred. Seventh, protein similarity in proportion to evolutionary divergence. Homologous features are not just restricted to macrophysiology, they also apply to the evolution of complex protein sequences, even down to the fine detail of protein folding architecture. Protein sequences are highly conservative, evolving so slowly that protein similarities can be traced from microfaunal ancestors some 2 billion years ago. Even on this timescale, the geological age is consistent with that inferred from evolutionary divergence rates. For a given protein family, the rate of change over evolutionary time is relatively constant. Hence, the branching pattern of homologous protein families, as in this slide, closely matches the evolutionary relationships of the species that express those proteins. During the last decade, evolutionary patterns have even been discovered amongst protein domains that have been shuffled from related genes, the so-called Mosaic proteins. To put it simply, the process of evolution occurs in both whole and partial protein architecture. Cytochrome and other mutation rate clocks. Cytochromes are iron or magnesium-rich colored proteins important in respiration and photosynthesis. The molecules cytochrome B and C have been useful in charting such links as sheep and mouflon evolution over the last 7 years, and primate evolution over the last 6 million years, both of which is verified by studies of retroviral host co-evolution. It has also been useful in charting much older transitions, such as invertebrates to vertebrates. Cytochrome analysis has illustrated the trends, but it isn't a perfect molecular clock. There are multivariate influences, so the rate of mutation isn't always constant, and hence more recent analysis has concentrated on better molecular timekeepers. These include CpG, which is a dinucleotide that binds to DNA and which transitions with a low rate of mutation. Also, there are long-chain fragment comparisons from fossil DNA, such as human-Neanderthal interactions. And a third example, hemoglobin. Disorders in hemoglobin and in non-globin genes found nearby on the same chromosome continue to yield important evolutionary understanding of blood disorders. Rates of evolutionary change over time yield so many molecular clocks. These may not be quite as precise as we would like, but nevertheless, thousands of evolution-based molecular clock studies make increasingly important contributions to medicine and to science in general. Reason number 9. I'm getting a bit technical here, but precise chromosomal location of pseudogenes are proofs of common ancestry. Many organisms, from humans to mice, fish, and even ryegrass, have nearly as many pseudogenes as useful genes. Pseudogenes are disposable or functionally useless. They were useful far back in time, but now they remain in our DNA simply because it is easier for a species to just switch off a useless gene rather than delete it completely. These turned off pseudogenes occur in close proximity to functional genes, indicating a former pre-evolved time when they were fully functional. Multiple related species carry these pseudogenes, for which the only explanation is common inheritance. For example, humans and closely related primates, and only those primates, carry the same psi-alpha globin pseudogene in exactly the same location in their chromosome. Why would closely related species carry the exact same mutated non-functional genetic error if they were not related by evolution? Reason 10. Oops, seem to have got a little bit out of sync here. Pardon, right. 0 to 10. Bottleneck divergence rates. These provide verification of long and short species durations as deduced independently. Humans are less genetically diverse than other large primates, such as chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. When a species faces near extinction, population numbers crash, and the gene pool is drastically reduced. This shows up in the reduced genetic diversity of that species for a long time afterwards. There is genetic, paleontological, and archaeological evidence that humans have been an endangered species on several occasions. In particular, 3 near extinctions are well documented at about 1.2 million years, 150,000 years, and 70,000 years. And these can be related to glacial advances and associated abrupt climatic change, and to volcanic eruptions. And there have been other genetic pinch points, such as the Naples regional extinction of 39,000 years ago. These population bottlenecks are well supported by the fossil record, but they are also supported by the genetic picture. This genetic spread argument is strong, but not totally conclusive, because recent genetic traits have poor resolution. There hasn't been sufficient time for the pinch point and subsequent genetic divergence through rapid adaptation to clearly develop. It could be argued that recent near extinction genetics could be explained by other processes. However, the genetic data does have the resolution to clearly identify an older genetic bottleneck of between 1 and 2 million years ago. Regardless of recent bottlenecks, this older bottlenecks is extremely strong evidence of the evolutionary process at work, leaving a clear genetic legacy. The evidence of direct observation. The 11th reason to believe in evolution. Modern day pathogens evolve really fast under the microscope. That's because of their large population sizes and the short regeneration time, which can be as short as 20 minutes. Consequently, the evolutionary dynamics of several diseases can be and have been studied over more than 60,000 generations. For example, gene analysis of pathogens shows that the plague, Yersinia pestis, has evolved through 5 ancestral strains in which the genetic mutation is well mapped, exactly in line with evolutionary theory. Also, we don't have to look far to see microbial evolution happening before our own eyes. We are all aware of the evolutionary process of antibiotic resistance. Whilst in less than the last 2 years, a dozen notable variants of the COVID-19 virus have developed, together with hundreds of mutations, again, exactly as expected in response to evolutionary pressures. 12th reason. There's a diverse range of fauna, including elephants, bats, orcas, naked mole rats, squirrels, and others, with what are known as genomic hotspots. These genetic hotspots resist cancer and other diseases through accelerated evolution. Also, artificially accelerated evolution of some proteins to evade viral attack is the only explanation of why some closely related species have developed independent ways of attaining immunity. Then, for at least the last 9,000 years, and probably for the last 11,000 years, humanity has made practical use of selective breeding to improve crops, first through selection of natural variation, and more recently via genetic engineering. This is artificially forced evolution. We have taken the natural process and accelerated it massively. If there was no evolutionary process to work with in the first place, then much of farming technology would have been in vain. We turn deliberate accelerated evolution to our own advantage every time we develop a crop by selective breeding. Biogeographic controls upon evolution. There are at least hundreds and possibly thousands of examples of evolution being controlled by biogeographic factors. In fact, about 70% of all present-day variation in faunal characteristics is related to geographic separation. This occurs through such constraints as island isolation, separation by continental drift, and through physical barriers like mountains, rivers, valleys, and deserts. Isolation of a population generally leads to either extinction or very rapid divergence into new species. This evolution directly and very obviously results from genetic isolation. It is seen through both extant species distribution and in the fossil record. We may cite just a handful of such examples. The Congo River, which separates chimpanzees to the north from bonobos to the south. Faunal provinces separated from major rivers in the Amazon River basin, as seen in this slide. In the Mediterranean, we have a ring distribution of scorpion species. Another example, camel speciation, Old World camels versus New World llamas and alpacas. In fact, the fact that there are no mammals on islands further than 500 kilometers from continental mainland is another example. And in the fossil record, we see regional speciation in trilobites, Europe versus North American, in marsupials, Australian versus South American, which we see developing after Pangaea's breakup 170 million years ago. We can cite ratites, the distribution of ostriches, emus, rheas, and moas. They all had a common origin in the fossil record prior to Pangaea's breakup and subsequent speciation. Ancestral birds of paradise in Australia and Papua New Guinea. And the Wallace line distribution of Asian versus Australasian fauna, and many other examples. The creationist explanation of all these distributions is that it is just a random radiation of animals after Noah's flood. But that's no explanation at all. It is factually naive and explains nothing. Coming back to early widespread fossil species during Pangaea, which evolved into separate but related regional fossil distributions following continental breakup, this is a perfect match between faunal assemblages and with independently established geological history. A history based upon whole libraries of geological evidence, but a history which never existed according to creationist theology. A 14th reason to believe in evolution, the observed evidence of evolution, which doesn't involve fossils. We see this in such things as pesticide resistance, which typically evolves over a decade or two, as shown in these graphs. But we don't have to restrict our observations to microbes or insects. From the 1970s to about 2000, Peter and Rosemary Grant observed and documented the evolution of Galapagos finches, evolving over a mere 30 years in response to seed availability induced by drought. There is even arsenic tolerance in worms at a disused copper arsenic mine in Devon in the UK. These worms have evolved their arsenic tolerance in only 170 years. Without evolution, they would all be dead. 15th reason, congruence between evolution and geological time. The science of geology blossomed during the 19th century, mostly in Scotland, England, France, Germany, and Switzerland. These pioneers were not God-hating miscreants. Some of them were even church ministers who set out to confirm a literal interpretation of biblical creation, but it very quickly appeared that they couldn't do it. The reality of evolution and the timescale over which it applied simply couldn't be condensed into a few thousand years. Later, the chronological evidence was validated by radiometric methods, of which radiocarbon was the most relevant to recent human evolution, and it's probably the one which is most popularly known. This method, radiocarbon, was confirmed by dozens of criteria, including these 10 examples of cross-checked, interconsistent, and fully calibrated independent dating methods. So we can look here, radiocarbon, at least part of the 60,000 year working range of radiocarbon overlaps with all these other methods, potassium argon, electron spin resonance, and so on. To this day, there are creationists, including some in Australia, who frantically attempt to discredit radiocarbon dating. Nobody is keeping a close tally on the number of radiocarbon measurements, but I estimate that by 2021, about 120 radiocarbon laboratories around the world must have measured roughly 1.5 to 2 million dates, which support the conventional geological and evolutionary history, and which includes known historic events, human artifacts well dated, cave remains, and much more. Scientists are not stupid. If they had a method which didn't work, they would abandon it. The fact that there are so many radiocarbon examples which does work is validation itself. But radiocarbon dating only works up to about 60,000 years. Beyond that, we must rely upon other methods whose typical working ranges are shown over a longer time scale, as in this slide. So here we have radiocarbon on the left here. That overlaps with thermoluminescence, fission track dating, uranium disequilibrium, potassium argon dates, all of them consistent. So we know that these other methods work. Note that the age range of some of these methods overlaps with and is consistent with those radiocarbon ages. And moreover, many of these rock dating methods overlap on greater timescales. Are they inconsistent with each other? Yes, they are. Are they consistent with the relative ages deduced from evolution's stratigraphic succession? Yes, eminently so. Notwithstanding creationism's appeal to the contrary, one of the most satisfying aspects of earth sciences is how well dozens of independent disciplines, including evolutionary biology, mesh together in supreme consistency and harmony. Bradytelly, the question of living fossils. Creationists love to uphold living fossils as supposed evidence that evolution never occurred. Actually, if we examine the genetic evidence, even modern examples of supposed living fossils are still evolving. It's just that it's at a very slow rate, a process known as bradytelly. There is no scientific imperative for all organisms to evolve at the same rate. In fact, there is this frequency distribution in evolutionary rates, as shown in this slide. To be sure, we don't know for certain that this distribution is exactly bell-shaped. That's just my approximation. But we do know that there are slow and fast outliers in the distribution, namely bradytelly, the so-called living fossils, and tachytelly, those species which speciate very rapidly. Both are exceedingly well explained by evolution, but not explained at all by anything else. If there is an exceptionally stable ecological niche with little or no predation, then there's no pressure to evolve at all, and hence species evolve so slowly as to appear almost identical over huge periods of time. Some examples, there's a mollusk called Lingula. It appears in the Cambrian strata as one of the early brachiopods, and it's still found today in the Gulf of Biscay. Another example, a Devonian shark called Cladosolage, very similar to modern sharks, and the well-known Latimeria, a Cretaceous fish which was found a few decades ago in some deep waters. Well, that's bradytelly. There's also the other extreme of tachytelly, fast evolution. And these include mammals, birds, reptiles in isolated islands or ephemeral lakes, and they typically evolve about 3 times faster than on the continental mainland. This is the founder effect, in which a restricted gene pool rapidly radiates out to occupy unfilled ecological niches. I've just given 2 examples here, the well-known case of Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands and cichlid fish evolution in East Africa. 500 new species in only 17,000 years. And very good examples of the rapid evolution. 17th reason to believe in evolution is when we look at corals and coral atolls. In marine sediments, corals aren't always ubiquitous, but they are very common. Especially in arid or semi-arid regions, there are countless thousands of rock outcrops in which fossil corals are present. They have been building atolls and reefs for slightly more than 400 million years, arguably even more than 550 million years if we include their Anthozoan predecessors. There are a handful of deep sea exceptions, but the vast majority of coral species rely on photosynthesis and hence only live in shallow seawater. But a paradox is that many atolls develop as limestone columns descending from the surface to the abyssal ocean depths. For example, in Fiji, some coral reefs are more than 900 meters above the ocean floor. In the Marshall Islands, it's 1,400 to 2,400 meters deep, whilst in the Maldives, the living coral surface is more than 3 kilometers above the ocean floor. These atolls and some other reefs form by a well-established and tested process, summarized in this slide. A fringe of corals grows around a volcanic seamount, as we see here. There is gradual subsidence caused by plate tectonic divergence, in which the corals keep growing whilst the volcanic base subsides. And eventually, we have this third case here. The volcanic base sinks far below the waves, leaving just a ring of coral limestone, usually with coral reef debris, sedimentary debris in between. Drill cores prove that even the deepest reef material is composed of shallow water corals, which lived in a depth of more than 40 meters. Sorry, less than 40 meters, the shallow water corals. To play devil's advocate, I've calculated that the absolute minimum age, which is wildly improbable, for these modern coral towers to develop is 167,000 years. And that is far longer than a strict creationist timeframe can allow. Realistically, taking a range of natural processes into account, the minimum age is likely to be between 500,000 and 1 million years. And yet, all of these modern coral towers are made exclusively of modern species. Going back much further in time, we can see a very clear and obvious evolutionary progression of coralline structures, a progression which spans the entire 400 million years. One thinks in particular of the greatest of all coral species transitions, two great coral families. First, the Rugosa, which lived until the Permo-Triassic faunal crisis of 252 million years ago, and second, the Scleractinian corals, which lived after 252 million years ago. There are absolutely no exceptions. You can search for thousands of marine limestone outcrops around the world, but you will find no Rugosa anywhere on planet Earth after that time boundary. And similarly, there are no Scleractinians anywhere on planet Earth before that time boundary. This can only be explained by evolution. The Rugosa evolved into Scleractinians. And by the way, that time period, a little bit before and a little bit after 252 million years ago, we can look at fossil corals from that time period, and we can see a very clear transition of coralline forms from the Rugosa to the Scleractinians. It's not a sudden thing at all. It's an obvious evolutionary progression. Well, don't panic. We are getting close to the end of the scientific case. But the 18th example, evolving cranial capacity in hominins. This slide shows the age of numerous hominin discoveries in species and subspecies spanning about the last 3 million years or so. The evolution of increased cranial capacities over that time is evident. The two end members, which we see here and somewhere over here, the two end members of this trend were once touted by creationists as a non-existent missing link. And yet, almost every new hominin discovery on or near the path to Homo sapiens serves to confirm this evolutionary trend. All of these sample points in the transition were claimed by creationists to be just non-existent. You know, there are no transition fossils, so they say. Fish to amphibians. The late Duane Gish, one of creationism's leading proponents for over 40 years, said that the discovery of only 5 or 6 transitional forms, that is, transition fossils, would be sufficient to document evolution. There are now hundreds of obvious transition fossils, well documented from the fossil record, and many thousands of less obvious transitional fossil forms. This example, fish to amphibians, is just one of the missing links denied by creationists. The fossilized transition from lobe-finned fish through fish with fingers to early amphibians and to late amphibians is all now well documented. Various stages of the transitions are always found in the same order. Not only that, but wherever the fossils are found for this transition, whether they're in USA, Canada, Greenland, Europe, or China. Wherever these fossils are found, they're always in the same order of evolution and only in Devonian strata of the age range 385 to 360 million years. How can that be if evolution isn't true? In scientific circles, one of the best predictors of a theory's validity is its ability to make accurate projections, that is, its predictive success. Darwin himself concluded that the weakest aspect of his theory was the scarcity of transitional organisms, where transitional fossils were, as it were, caught in the act of evolving from one species to another. Darwin rightly attributed this to the low probability of transient organisms being fossilized. My Uniting Church once had a fundamentalist minister who insisted that there was no such thing as a transition fossil and challenged me to name one. At the time, I didn't bother, but I now wish I had, because unlike in Darwin's day, back in 1859, there are now roughly 400 highly predictable transition fossils, every one of which stands as smoking gun evidence in favor of evolution. For example, biologists have long noted the apparent evolutionary progression from segmented marine worms with bilateral symmetry to fossilized and modern mollusks. The problem was that neither extant nor fossil evidence could be found for such an evolutionary jump. The predicted transitional form was embarrassingly missing until 1952, when a group of monoplacophorans, primitive living marine mollusks, was dredged from a depth of about 3.5 kilometers from off the coast of Costa Rica. This amazing mollusk, named Neopolina, was a relic of the worm-mollusk transition of 400 million years ago. It had exactly all the predicted features: paired multiple organs, partial segmentation, and a primitive gill structure. It was a triumph of evolutionary prediction. And Neopolina is not alone. There are, as I said, more than 400 predicted transition fossils which have now been discovered. To give just a few examples, Archaeopteryx, a transitional form from dinosaur to bird, which has since been verified by numerous more detailed transitional fossils from Western China. Pachycetus, a transitional species from the Eocene of Pakistan, on its way to evolving into modern whales and sharing an ear structure unique only to whales. Petacyron portelli, which is a 50 million year transition fossil from Jamaica, intermediate between dugongs or manatees and land-based quadrupeds. And Tiktaalik, a 375 million year old transition fossil discovered in the Canadian Arctic in 2004, also known as a fisherpod. It is the long conjectured transition from a fish to four-legged land animals. It has gills, scales, lungs, a movable neck, lobed fins, and a studdy rib cage, exactly as predicted by evolution. And only a few weeks ago, yet another transitional fossil hit the headlines: Thiamicitus Anubis, a four-legged whale in transition from being a land mammal to a genuine ocean-going whale. This fossil was 43 million years old, found in Egypt. Similarly, another transition fossil, not distantly related, was found in Peru with webbed feet and hooves, also on its way to becoming a whale. And this argument could go on for hours, to include elephants, horses, spiny-boned fish, insects, spiders, toothless mammals, lizards to snakes, pterosaurs, archosaurs to dinosaurs, and many others, including at least 20 distinct pre-human species which have evolved during the past 7 million years. Well, you'll be relieved to know that I haven't the energy to argue any further. I stop at 20 reasons to believe that evolution is fully validated. There's a superabundance of evidence to support the theory, while there's no credible scientific evidence against it, although there's no shortage of popular creationist magazines which attempt to argue to the contrary. My speciality is in earth sciences. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, although if I were, I have no doubt that the list could be extended to 30, 40, or even 50 arguments. The problem is that few creationists will ever be swayed, no matter how much scientific argument is advanced. Unfortunately, much of humanity has recently dispensed with the need for evidence. For the non-scientific majority, truth has become whatever one wishes to believe, as reinforced by amplification from the internet and social media. I'm sorry to observe that this woeful flight from reality has been led by Americans in general and by American fundamentalists in particular, which is not a good advertisement for the veracity of our gospel of salvation. Back in 1927, George Macready Price, a Canadian and lifelong anti-evolutionist, claims this, and I quote, "The whole of evolution is crumbling to pieces. A literal creation of all the great primal types of plant and animals, including man, is the only fact left for men who are acquainted with the progress of scientific discoveries in modern times." Really? It is now just under a century since George foretold of evolution's demise. And in all that time, evolution has crumbled to the point where it is now the best verified scientific theory in the entire history of human thought. To be fair, democratic and even-handed, as the creationists and intelligent design protagonists repeatedly insist, we must also examine the flip side. That is, the bona fide scientific evidence against evolution. But there is none. I challenge any of you at any time to come up with a single, credible, valid scientific argument to refute evolution. Having been defeated on scientific grounds, many creationists resort to such arguments as evolution has been the root of so much anti-God sentiment that no true Christian can seriously entertain it. They cite the following evils to evolution. Quite a list. But this argument has nothing to do with the scientific theory of evolution. It is an attack upon a singular, extreme extrapolation of evolution, an extrapolation which I and most other scientists would regard as seriously flawed. I totally reject these accusations as demonstrably false and nothing to do with genuine evolutionary science. A further anti-evolutionary argument goes like this: God is in control, therefore the blind, directionless randomness of evolutionary process denies God. It can't be God and evolution, it has to be God or evolution. Superficially, this may sound like a rational argument, but it is a polarized and shallow dichotomy, which I also don't accept. My view is that it can certainly be and is God and evolution. How can it be both? Well, consider this hypothetical scenario. 3 countries with 2 princes vying for the hand of a princess, let us say. Both princes have blood in their bodies which contains potassium. Potassium is slightly radioactive. A completely unpredictable and apparently random fission takes place with the potassium nucleus changing into other radionuclides, and an energetic alpha particle, which could split a nearby DNA fragment, causing cancer so that A or C dies. So the survivor could found a history-changing dynasty of equal probability. A tiny little process with massive ramifications. Was that splitting atom truly random or of God's volition? It is intrinsically impossible to know. Only by faith can we attribute this to the hand of God. It can be both random from our perspective and God directed. God and evolution together are perfectly possible. There are countless trillions of quantum events happening in every second of history. God uses some of these via covert amplification, such as by the butterfly effect, so called, if you will, and he uses this to achieve his purpose. There are countless numbers of examples of this in the Bible. Earthquakes, storms, volcanic eruptions, locust swarms, strong winds, quail migration, and so on and so on. All start with quantum fluctuations where God's hand is covert, and yet God achieves his purpose through such covert effects. So why the problem with evolution? Why this needless and unwinnable war with science? At its root, it is because of the doctrine of literal biblical inerrancy. Alas, anti-evolutionists and intelligent design protagonists, particularly in America, still insist that we should teach the controversy. But what controversy? There's no controversy. As far as science is concerned, the question of whether evolution is real was sorted out more than a century ago. That issue is done and dusted. They argue that in the interests of fairness and democracy, we should present both sides of the creationist and evolution arguments in schools and elsewhere. But that's like saying that in the interests of even-handedness, we should give equal credence to both demonstrable truth and demonstrable falsehood, which is logically inconsistent. Sadly, in the 21st century, many have already made up their minds and do not wish to be confused by the facts. We are backpedaling from the Age of Enlightenment. In many respects, Western science has failed. People will believe what they want to believe, irrespective of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Sadly, many Christians have not just been swept along by this tide, they have actually led the charge. These well-meaning but seriously misguided Christians put a low value upon rationality. They do not follow the tried and tested principles of scientific method. They have abandoned 400 years of the Enlightenment, or to put it another way, they have discarded science itself, which is our proven best shot at establishing truth in the physical realm. Science should be our ally in proclaiming the truth about the Bible's witness to Christ. Instead, they have disastrously made an enemy of science. They have effectively abandoned not just the disciplines of biology and geology, but all of science. In so doing, they have substituted an embarrassing parody of science, which is recognized by most non-Christians as being intellectually untenable. Of course, every new scientific validation of evolution results in creationist pushback. My response is to look beyond the frantic rhetoric and examine the scientific core of their argument. In every case, it boils down to insubstantial, nebulous fluff, which may seem scientific, but which carries no weight. It disregards scientific method altogether. Whenever I see creationism in action, I worry about its negative impact upon God's kingdom. If someone throws a stone at a tank trundling down the road, it may gratify the outrage of the stone thrower. but it doesn't destroy the tank, nor does it stop the tank. It doesn't even slow it down. It's just an insubstantial response which achieves nothing, much as the creationist literature achieves nothing. Anti-evolutionary creationists have created a needless obstacle to the very gospel, that we proclaim. In one North American study, 67% of youngsters who have been brought up in a Christian environment had abandoned Christianity. And the foremost reason given was that they could not reconcile fundamentalist teaching with the evident truth of evolution. The alternative perspective, the Hebrew content and context for reading Genesis 1 to 11, wasn't just overthrown, it was never even considered in the first place. For many reasons, I would argue that a Greco-Roman post-Enlightenment, scientific, literal 19th century frame of reference for reading scripture is inappropriate. At best, it has created disturbing cognitive dissonance in the minds of millions of Christians. At worst, it has undermined and in many cases totally wrecked the faith of countless more Christians. This is a serious setback for God's kingdom and for the credibility of the gospel of salvation in the world. Some have even argued that this false paradigm is a disgrace to the God of truth. It has been unambiguously identified as one of the principal reasons for the decline in Western Christianity over recent decades. Frankly, this anti-evolution stance is regarded as antiquated and absurd amongst a high proportion of educated 21st century humanity. When it comes to evolution, an estimated 35 to 40% of the world's Christians have been taught a fundamentalist error, which has not gone unnoticed by non-Christians. How many potential Christians have had their eternal destiny torn away because they have been repelled by this creationist flight from reality? When Martin Luther saw serious error within the church, he did something about it. So who in the 21st century will stand up to creationist falsehood in the modern church? It is time to bring the whole church, kicking and screaming if needs be, back into reality, to an understanding in which God uses and continues to use evolution. Thank you for your kind attention. Now permit me to put on my bulletproof vest before we begin discussion time.
Gordon, in my opinion, you made numerous assertions. You asserted lots and lots and lots of things, but I didn't hear any proof or anything. I really didn't. There might be evidence, but you just simply assert things.
Well,
and you've got to take it on, you're putting it in such a way that, yes, we've got to take it as true because you've got a technical word for this and a technical word for that. But it's just not proof. None of that was proof. Like, for example, you did this over and over with all your, every one of them. I didn't really see any proof at all there. So take, for example, the coral reef situation. You say, well, there's coral reefs like this, there's coral reefs like that, there's an island like this and everything. But has anybody seen one illustration evolve into the other? No, of course not, and you haven't either. So you make a certain, you suppose a certain progression that, well, you've got, this is at a certain stage and then there's this one and there's this one. There's no proof of that. It's just your imagination putting it together like that. It was like that with every argument you put. I didn't hear any proof.
Could I just talk on that example with the atolls then? So Gordon, could you just repeat what I gather from what you said, that the fact that they're recent and so other stuff is missing.
No, my main argument was, well, firstly, let me go back a bit. In science, we don't talk about absolute proof, except possibly in mathematical terms. But there is an extremely high probability of things based upon what we observe. And okay, maybe you don't want to call it proof, but the balance of probability is phenomenally in favor of evolution. And now to get to the corals argument, the rugosa, the old rugosa, only occur in the older strata. In modern strata, anything after that, 272 million years, whatever it was, they're all Scleractinians. Now that, because the one evolved into the other. Now that relation doesn't.
That's just an assertion.
It's a fact. You can observe corals anywhere on planet Earth, and you.
Okay, they're their facts. Yeah, I accept that. That's evidence, and there's facts. But now you've asserted that one type evolved into the other. How do you know that? Is that true? You've got certain evidence. Yeah, we can all accept evidence.
Okay.
You do it over and over. It's the same with these species, which are supposedly these links that were discovered. All it proves, all this fossil proves, is that, well, there once was an animal that was like this, that's supposedly a transition, but there's no proof that it's a transition.
Excuse me, Jeff. I think that the nature of his argument is the confirmation of the sequence in development over time of various species, because the coral showed a snapshot in time which was consistent with the evolutionary development from other sources. Is that what you're saying?
And it's not just one snapshot. You can. You can take a section of corals of different ages, look at it under a microscope, you look at the detailed structure, and you can see that progression from one style of septa within the coral to another style, from the rugosa to the Scleractinian.
Gordon, would that be microevolution or macroevolution, that type of change? Because it's the same thing. It's not like a coral becoming a tree. It's still a coral, isn't it? Like, is it within the same species?
It's
still coral, isn't it?
It's still a coral.
Yeah, I've got no problem with coral changing because of climate or acidity or something, from one changing over time or whatever. But what I find is changing into a completely different species. That's what I have problems with.
If you go back further in history, you can look at the Anthozoan transition to the coral Sencho stricto, and you can go further back in time and look at the transition from porifera to Anthozoans and so on.
But Jeff's making the point that we can't really. We're making assumptions that they're changing into that one. They're not. We can't actually witness it.
No, it's not making that assumption. It's not what it's trying to prove. It's not trying to prove that one transition to another. It's just providing a snapshot in time of what species were present.
Yeah.
Multiple snapshots.
Multiple snapshots. Yeah.
Yes, and it follows that logical order which you expect.
Yeah. Okay. Leonard's trying to say something. You need to unmute. Turn your microphone on. Leonard, you'll need to turn your microphone on.
Underlying all of this discussion is the question of what is science. Now, Francis Bacon set it up as the study of the mechanical behavior of the material aspects of the universe. And what that amounts to is that science is what you do with controlled, repeatable experiments. Now, there are no controlled, repeatable experiments that you can do on fossils. This is actually history. And you can't call it science. I don't know why it keeps being labelled as science. Science is what you do with controlled, repeatable experiments.
Deduction from the...
Marx and Freud called their stuff science because in the 19th century, after the magnificent explosion of knowledge with the 17th century scientific revolution in England and such like, everything called itself a science. Marx and Freud did that. And so is paleontology, which is not science. It's the writing of a proposed history of what is there.
No, it's deductions of observations. That is absolutely science. I don't see how you could argue it's anything but science. It uses scientific method. And I don't care what Bacon or anyone else says. I'm talking about the modern concept of scientific method. That's what is used. It is undoubtedly scientific.
No, there are scientists now who are saying, look, science is what you do with controlled, repeatable experiments, and all these other studies might be very good and legitimate in their method, but they are not science.
Well, yeah, again, we're going to have to completely disagree.
You could say it's there's different branches or types of science.
No, in Aristotle's terms, they are different forms of legitimate study.
Excuse me.
Just wait.
Can you put the word science to them? And that's where the confusion arises.
You can come closer.
I've just searched up the dictionary definition of science. The intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. It says nothing about controlled or repeatable.
Well, it says experiment, though, doesn't it?
It simply says experiment.
Yeah. So, yeah, I would say that like there's empirical science and then there's forensic science. So I think some sort of flexibility is required in how you actually define science. And
Another thing I felt throughout your address, Gordon, you use the term evolution very loosely, and I think mostly you're talking about variation within the species, and which I perfectly will accept, and I expect that Brian does too, and lots of other people. There certainly is variation within the species. That can be by natural means, or it can be by when humans are in control. It can be by deliberately, breeding or manipulating the genetics and so on. But it's variation within the species, and we're not arguing about that. But has there ever been any evidence of one species evolving into another species?
Well, yeah, the whole record of let's see, dinosaurs going into land-based dinosaurs going into flight dinosaurs.
Sorry, where's the what? That's not evidence. Has anybody seen a land-based dinosaur evolve into a type of dinosaur?
The amount of evidence is being dug up every week in China.
No, there's evidence of a pterodactyl existing once upon a time that had flight. And has
intermediate forms, and then intermediates between the intermediate form and the early one, and then the intermediates between the intermediate and the later version. It's always that whole progression, that whole evolutionary progression is being refined and improved the whole time. And
it doesn't prove one thing evolved into another. It's just like axolotls, people got very excited when axolotls were either discovered or popularized because they have certain features about them that, well, heck, it looks a bit like a fish. Oh, no, it looks a bit like a reptile. But axolotls are just axolotls, and they always have been. They bred from previous axolotls, which came from previous axolotls and so on. It doesn't prove that a certain fish species evolved into an axolotl, which then evolved into a bird. All this is supposition. This is all imagination. It's not.
Jeff, you're using phrases like "it looks a bit like." No, paleontology is a lot more technical and science-based than that. It's not just a question of looks a bit like. It's when you look at the fine, detailed bone structure.
That doesn't prove evolution at all.
I'd say that kind of forensic science is more like when you actually do a police investigation to find whether somebody's guilty or innocent of a crime. Like you can't actually go back and perform experiments, but you can still look at the evidence and actually form a deduction and make a decision beyond reasonable doubt. So just because you can't do experiments doesn't mean something is not true. It goes back to this kind of probability argument.
Also, based on what Leonard was saying, just because you can provide a reasonable argument based on evidence does not make it science.
Well, we're not. Does this definition of what is science really matter? The issue is whether it's true or not, isn't it?
Yep, that's, in my opinion, yes.
Yeah.
But people use the word science because the word science gives weight to something, whether that weight is justified or not.
I think the science does give weight to anything anymore. That's changed, but it is the reasoned argument that carries the weight.
Yeah, I think it should be looked as more like a court investigation rather than yeah.
My question here is, how much of all of this is subject to, in my skeptical philosophical output, outlook on it all, how much of all of this turned into that and everything else, how much of it is an interpretation with confirmation bias? Because they just cannot allow any other interpretation. And what you haven't addressed, Gordon, is Niles Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould with their punctuated equilibrium from the 1970s, because they said, no, the fossil record does not show Darwinian gradualism. So as atheists and as Marxists, we're going to import our doctrine of Marxist revolutions and we're going to call it punctuated equilibrium. That it all goes stable for a long time. Then there's a huge turnover, out come all these new species. What?
I don't utilize that concept of punctuated equilibrium. I think just the fossil record itself stands as its own best testament. Just look at the way more and more all the gaps between different forms are being filled in as more and more fossils turn up. I think that's sufficient evidence by itself, combined with the genetic evidence, combined with the geographic evidence, combined with the other aspects that I've looked at, combined with the geological evidence and the age relationships and so on. It just puts together a massive, coherent, consistent framework of explaining what we see. And there is nothing else that even remotely comes close to it.
Can I just share a couple of quotes that I find quite interesting from some evolutionary biologists referring to the Cambrian explosion. They say the Cambrian explosion of body plans is perhaps the single most striking feature of the Metazoan fossil record. The rapidity in which the phyla and classes appeared poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution, and that was by George Gregory Ray. He was an evolutionary biologist. Another one, elucidating the materialistic basis of the Cambrian explosion has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. And that's Kevin Peterson, an evolutionary biologist. Another one by Richard Dawkins, the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. The first time they appear, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. And that's by Richard Dawkins himself. So while I really appreciate everything you put together tonight, and I think there's still gaps that the evolutionists can't answer. It's not just presented open or finished,
When all those quotations you get, basically they're out of date. There's more mounting evidence for everything from the Flinders Ranges up to Siberia of Eocambrian fossils, stuff which is older than 600 million years. There's a lot of development, but we didn't see it because there's no hard parts to actually be preserved in the rocks. The more we look at it, the more we realize that it wasn't just a sudden explosion of forms, about 600, 550, whatever it is, million years ago.
Yeah.
There was a massive evolutionary explosion long before that, and what we're looking at is not sudden new species appearing. What we're looking at is the transition from soft-bodied to hard-bodied animals. That's all it is. So I wouldn't put much emphasis on this great Cambrian explosion.
So the soft bodies suddenly form the hard bodies that we see.
They developed ways of developing an exoskeleton. Yeah.
But with just a question on that, with the sudden appearance of basically bones, isn't it, hard bits? Wouldn't you expect that would actually originate in one species? Like, why would it have such broad sudden appearance over so many species? Wouldn't it, for bones to kind of spread through the animal kingdom, wouldn't they kind of need a single origin rather than all happening at once over for many species?
Well, one of the problems is that we don't have enough Eocambrian fossils to really answer that question.
Do you understand the nature of my question?
Yeah. You could argue that way.
Yeah, because like basically bones appeared broadly across a wide variety of species.
But it wasn't a sudden change so all species had fossilizable parts. There's a lot of stuff even in the Cambrian, which is just smudgy imprints of soft-bodied creatures of one sort or another that hadn't at that stage gained the ability to form an exoskeleton.
Well, we still have smudgy animals now, don't we?
Yeah.
What about the fact that between the Jurassic and Triassic, or Triassic and Jurassic periods, they're saying there's only 10,000 years between when the dinosaurs were wiped out and then they reappeared again? Yeah.
There must have been some survivors.
No, they said it was that was impossible because of what had happened to the Earth at that time.
What happened to the Earth at that time?
There was some type of mediator event. Yeah. So between the this is Olson, Kent and colleagues. This is from a blog from readers.org. An analysis of the trepided footprints and skeletal materials for more than 70 locations across eastern North America show that large trepided dinosaurs appeared less than 10,000 years after the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. The mass Jurassic speciation event arose within 10,000 years. We're not talking microbes or bacteria, but large trepided dinosaurs. Not only do the body size and complexity of the new species astound researchers, but also their timing. They appeared while environmental conditions were hostile, what is known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province event, which deposited 4 to 6 meters of lava over the entire Earth and spewed out sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And it acidified the oceans, wiping out all pH-sensitive marine organisms, while vast wildfires erupted across the land masses. The appearance of the theropod dinosaurs perplexes the evolutionary biologists. None of these models was capable of explaining such a rapid, dramatic evolutionary advance.
Well, I would say that's true of a particular region, North America. The volcanism was certainly not worldwide. It was very much a North Atlantic feature. And maybe there was a demise and speciation again of dinosaurs quite rapidly in that area, but there are many other parts of the world which were linked at that time, have since drifted apart because of continental drift. So I think it's a dubious argument. You would need to look at the global picture. That's just a regional picture.
Another problem I have with it, all this is because from a astronomical event sort of viewpoint, you've got life doesn't, like Earth doesn't just start out and just stay the same over billions of years. It changes, and there's like fantastic astronomical events that happen, and changes in, you know, the oxygen level and the brightness of the sun, and the moon becoming further away, so the tidal changes, the radiation effect from the centre of the Earth, snowball events, gamma ray bursts. What else is there? There's changes in the solar system. Yeah, it's just, it's not, people don't really realise that it's not consistent with, you know, just life's here, the sun's shining, you know, water's there, and everything goes along hunky-dory, and you can change and evolve, and you know, okay, you die out, but you know, there's time for things to happen again. It's not a, you know, a happy sort of environment or easy to live in, you know. So
we've had 3 billion years of evolution. Yeah. Certainly hasn't all been plain sailing. If it hadn't for all these things you speak of, we could have evolved probably very much faster, but in a different direction.
Yeah.
And it's pointless for us, I think, to speculate as to what was the extent to which God's hand molded things along the way. It's just intrinsically impossible to know. And by faith, assume that God's hand was manipulating all these forces and these catastrophic events to produce something like us. In the creation story, everything was good until we came along and we were very good. That's what God intended. Yeah.
That kind of prompts one of the questions I'd written down earlier. So far as your personal understanding of evolution is concerned, is it one, that it required divine intervention all the way through for it to happen as it did, or two, that it could have happened exactly as it is believed to have happened if God set it off at the start and then just left the universe to run by itself? Or could it have happened exactly as it is believed to have happened, even if there is no God?
I suppose hypothetically it could have happened if there was no God, but then you still have the problem of ultimate causality. Why is there anything?
So that brings you back to number two, a deistic perspective. Would it work? I'm not saying that you are a deist. I'm asking if that perspective would work.
Possibly.
But do you believe in it?
No, I think we all of us probably have sufficient faith to assume that God's hand is in everything. But we can't prove it.
Mine was purely a mechanistic type question rather than a what do you believe directly type question.
Mm-hmm.
So, yep. It didn't need God. It needed God to start it off. It didn't need God to run it.
Hypothetically, I would say it didn't need God to run it, but in reality, God underpins everything. So
things are chaotic in the present, aren't they? But we still believe that God's running it. Can I get a question to Brian? Gordon's presented a picture of species varying over time. So do you have a problem with that?
I'm not sure who it was mentioned it about not having a problem with species varying, e.g. wolves turning into chihuahuas and Great Danes. But that is just standard. You start off with a sufficiently complicated genome, losing bits and pieces along the way. You can end up with that through natural circumstances, e.g. climate conditions varying where certain species are, or human intervention to selectively breed. It effectively cuts down on the amount of variation living with the specific varieties. So yeah, that's perfectly feasible. But turning dolphins into dogs is another matter entirely.
Yeah, but all right, but do you kind of accept that the composition of the animal kingdom has actually changed over time?
In the sense that I mentioned it, yes.
So at one time there were dinosaurs, now they're not, and
There were Tasmanian devils, now there are not. Tigers, and now there are not.
all right, so they can go extinct, but they also came into existence at various points in time, and whether they survive or not is another issue. But the species appeared over a period of time.
Well, a period of time, yes. What that period of time is another matter.
All right, but because like what Gordon is saying is that you had various development of various species appear over time. So with in the human kingdom, it started off with
Australopithecus,
and now we have Homo sapiens, and there are various different types of human beings along the way. So are you comfortable with that or not?
Depends if my interpretation of what you just said is correct or not. So possibly yes, possibly no.
Right. Okay. Yeah, but like you're, to put a label on you, you're a young Earth person, aren't you?
Yes.
And so you would say you'd reject the millions of years,
yep.
But you'd accept some form of changing species over time.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask why, Brian, do you reject the old age of the Earth when there's so much evidence to prove it?
There is a lot of evidence, and as I said at the start, it's all open to interpretation. None of us were there to see it. And there are factors that can be interpreted as long age. There are other factors which can be interpreted only as short age. For example, the decay of the magnetic field of the Earth, the salinity of the oceans, the comets, the size of Saturn's ring. There are a number of things that indicate a much shorter age.
So is your view driven by the science or your interpretation of the Bible?
It's driven, I would assume, by my interpretation of the Bible firstly, but I'm convinced that the science matches up with that.
All right, Eliza would like to say something.
With all the signs you were talking about, ocean salinity, Saturn's rings, decay of the magnetic field, how exactly does that correspond?
It can be, at the moment, you can measure, for example, the rate of decay of the Earth's magnetic field, and you can extrapolate backwards until you get to a point where the magnetic field would be so strong that it would be impossible for life to exist on this Earth. And that goes into the thousands of years, not the billions. The rate of decay of Saturn's rings, what I read's got a maximum age at the rate it's going of around about 40, 50,000 years. So the rings cannot be older than that.
Couldn't they have formed later on?
Yes, by what mechanism?
Break off of one of its many moons.
There's also some fact, I think that one's been guessed, but assuming the moons were made of ice, because that's apparently what the rings are made out of.
It could be comets pulled into Saturn's gravity well.
Again, if the comets are made of ice, but
which they are.
In that sense, why only Saturn? Why not any of the other planets? There's also the interesting fact that based on the theories of the formation of the solar system, there are some planets that are spinning or traveling the wrong way, which kind of confuses things a bit.
Also, earlier you said, why not other planets? The only ones with large enough gravitational wells, the gas giants, they actually do have rings.
Not in the same sense that Saturn has, but yeah, it's a point.
Well, actually, it is in the same sense that Saturn has. It's just they're smaller, that's all.
And
sorry, that wasn't what I meant.
And maybe the fact that Saturn's rings are bigger is a combination of the sweet spot of the size of the gravitational well and distance from the sun, which allows comets to be more plentiful.
Can Can I make some comments from my background? I've ended up as a high church Anglican at St. Peter's Cathedral, but I grew up as an independent Baptist missionary kid to the Walpurgis at Yuendamu and the Western Arranters at Alice Springs, and before that, the Warramungas at Tennant Creek. They're my Aboriginal.
I want you to write it down.
And I watched, and it gives me an enormous understanding of the Old Testament and all of its tribal structure and behaviour. And what I watched in retrospect, after going through a scientific training at Adelaide University, I went back to a lot of this and I thought, when I watched the creation story from Genesis being told to the Aborigines, what I realised was that what they took from it was the two questions that everybody wants to know: who and why. God created it all, and he made it for relationships with us and with nature and with each other. And that's the who and the why. And when you ask the questions that we worry about since the 17th century, which is when and how, if you ask the Aborigines, they'd say, oh, back in the dream time, no worries. How did God do it? And they'd look at you as though you're a bit strange and say, only God knows. And so out of all of that thinking, what I've ended up with is what I'd call being an ultimate creationist. God is behind it all, and all timescales and all mechanisms possible, and even some that we don't know, are open to him. And so I don't get fussed with any of this sort of argumentation or anything. I think, well, it's when God said this and did that and everything else, a lot of it is what I call performative utterance, where this judge sent that man to jail. No, the judge doesn't do anything to actually put that man in jail. The judge makes his utterance, and then the whole process takes on. And I think a lot of what it talks about in the Old Testament of God's word and God saying this and that and everything else is a performative utterance. And what the mechanism and intermediaries were to put that into action is completely open to us. We don't know. We weren't there.
Yeah, I think Gordon would probably be pretty comfortable with that.
Absolutely. Look, creationists try to rubbish my position and saying that I'm trying to rubbish Genesis 1 to 11. Absolutely not. Genesis 1 to 11 is brilliant. It's a superb bit of literature. It encapsulates the entire theme of the Bible, and it has vivid imagery which is used, reverberates throughout the rest of the Bible. It's a superb bit of literature and a superb foundation for everything. I'm not rubbishing it at all. It's the over literal view rather than the Hebrew imagery that
what I saw the Aborigines take from it is the questions that everybody of whatever education level or culture wants to know, which is who and why. And then the mechanistic questions of when and how, they're of no interest to them.
Okay.
And I think, well, that's probably of no interest to those original writers of all of this either.
Yeah, they are of interest to me, being an earth scientist. Can I come back to Brian? Brian, you talked about the young earth evidence being that of salt and the
no, just a few examples I could think up. There are many others that can't think of at the moment.
Yeah, and exactly. And you can go through every single one of them, and you can point out that this magnetic field argument is just extrapolation to absurdity. You're just assuming a linear extrapolation. We know for a fact that the variation in the Earth's magnetic field has been phenomenal, and it has changed again and again, hundreds of times. And we've got fully documented evidence of how this is done and where it's happened and when it's happened and so forth. The creationist argument it just does not apply. Similarly, with the salt argument, you say that the build-up of salt in the sea can only be done because of the recent creation history. That doesn't work either, because we know that the salt deposition and evaporation is cyclic and has been for at least the last few billion years.
You're talking about extrapolation to the extreme. I was extrapolating for thousands of years. You're extrapolating for billions.
No. What I'm saying is it's a complex relationship. You can't do a linear extrapolation that leads to absurd conclusions.
So you're saying it's cyclic rather than one way?
Well, it's not cyclic, it's episodic.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yes, it varies enormously according to the configuration of the continents, according to continental drift and so forth.
So the salt comes in and out of the ocean in a cyclic pattern.
There is a salt cycle, but it's not sinusoidally cyclic, if you see what I mean. It's complicated, episodic. Yeah. And the same for so many other creationist arguments. Superficially, they look plausible, but delve into it, look at it in detail, look at the actual scientific evidence, and they don't stack up.
What do you think God thinks with all this argument that we have? What's he kind of doing in it? Do you think God is getting upset because one side is wrong?
I think God is getting upset because we Christians are putting obstacles in the way of God's kingdom, coming on earth. We pray in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come.
Yeah.
Jesus himself, at the start of his ministry, he had a fishing trip as a kind of living parable, and he did the same again at.
What's God doing in all this?
At the start and the end of his ministry, he had this fishing trip parable, if you like, about being fishers of men. We're supposed to fish for men, draw people into his kingdom. But what we're doing when we make massive mistakes.
Get that one as well.
What we're doing is going fishing with massive holes in our fishing net. This creationism false view of our Earth's history, false view of how we've been misinterpreting Genesis 1-11. That's caused all kinds of problems, which are stopping people becoming Christian.
Yes, alive.
Hey, Kevin.
Well, I'm thinking. Maybe God isn't upset because one side is wrong. Maybe it doesn't really matter. And he's just upset because we're letting ourselves get distracted within fighting.
Well, definitely that last point, but God is interested in truth, whatever truth is. But at the same time, God also cares that we are interested in truth. And the fact that we might disagree and discussing it earnestly would be good from God's perspective, in that it implies that we care about what is true. Even if we happen to disagree on what that truth is, it proves a commitment to truth that God would appreciate.
Yeah. I also think that God likes us to actually develop like patience, gentleness, etc. And a lot of these things, what really matters is how we treat each other, and how we talk to each other and show respect. So I think God has that agenda in our development as well.
Yep.
So like a lot of this debate's been pretty emotional and highly felt, but I'm actually generally happy with the way everybody's spoken to each other. So, because I think that's maybe just as important as whether you're right or wrong. But also I'd say, if you're going to assert something dogmatically, then you better be pretty certain that you're right.
Yeah, and also, I don't think anyone's deliberately trying to, stop people from coming to Christ. That's not our...
Well, Well, people, I mean, I'm not against creationists. I've met many creationists, some of which are absolutely lovely people, but they are doing damage to God's kingdom, frankly.
Yeah, but I don't know.
Interesting point, but Gordon needs to hear this one. But Gordon is saying that creationists are doing damage to God's kingdom, and creationists are saying that people like him are doing damage to God's kingdom.
That's right.
We all are.
So that's a very good point.
Young Earth or old Earth, creationist or evolutionist, can't we just be Christians? Why can't we just be Christians?
Well, we are, and this is all peripheral stuff, but Gordon is trying to make the point that some people who are very science-based find it hard to find God because they get put off by people that believe in the Bible. Now, Gordon and I have a bit of a difference of opinion because I'm more of an integrationist than he would be. To get to the pointy end, my problem I have with evolution is probably Adam, right? A mankind evolving with an end point into Adam. And if that's, or not, no, actually, is there an Adam? That's one of my questions. Do you believe that there was Adam and Eve? And I'm assuming you probably don't, but I might be wrong.
In the original Hebrew, Adama is mankind, not an individual.
Man, which could be interpreted either way.
Same as Eve, which is the mother of all living. And I think a case could be made, and maybe I'd like to make it at some stage, that you can go through the Bible, including parts of the New Testament, and look at cases where you could interpret Adam and Eve and various other things in the Genesis 1 to 11. You can interpret it as a literal sense, or as in the Hebrew imagery sense, and it's the Hebrew sense that makes the better sense of those two alternatives every time.
So that it wasn't
This
one.
comes up in my comments on the book of Job, where I say that it's a parable, and people say, well, if he wasn't literal, then look at these references to him in the New Testament, that he must have existed. And I say, look, one of the most influential persons on the Western civilization for the last 2,000 years is the Good Samaritan, who never existed. He was a parable.
Yeah.
I think Eliza would like to say something. To say
on the concept of Adam and Eve, maybe that's just imagery defining one of these many genetic bottlenecks.
Yeah, but where does our sinful nature come from? You get into philosophical sort of dilemmas.
Certainly imagery. I don't see any real connection with the genetic bottleneck, because genetic bottleneck is coming back to try and putting an absolute literal spin on Adam and Eve. I think the whole meaning of that story of the fall of man works just as well in the big picture parabolic imagery sense of Hebrew writing. It makes better sense reading it that way than as
what about Paul in I think it was Romans 5, he said he compares Jesus with Adam. So did Jesus or the New Testament authors believe in a historical Adam?
Well, again, you can read it either way. You can.
So if there's
you read Adam as a literal one-person man, or as the kind of forerunners, the antecedents of humanity, if you like.
But then aren't we reinterpreting historical Christianity if we say that?
Jesus himself did some reinterpreting as well.
Jesus.
I think there's quite a few problems with all this. If Adam and Eve are not actual historical characters, they're some kind of representation of mankind or something. Where does history actually begin? Who's the first actual historical character in the Bible record? That's one question.
Abraham, probably.
Yes, I know. As well. Yeah. What about Abraham's father? Terah? Is he real?
This is where it never fussed me with the Aboriginal background, that it had to be a story with meaning, and the meaning was more important than the story.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't get wound up with all of these details.
I think it's got another problem too, and that is that if all people on the earth are not actually descended from one origin, then that leaves grounds wide open for saying, well, that actual race, those black people, they're not actually as human as we are. They're really from some other species. And well, those Asian people, they're from somewhere different too. And the Mongolians and etc. So it just leaves the door wide open for racism.
There is no scientific basis for saying that humanity is split into different species. Absolutely. On the contrary.
So they all actually came from one origin, did they?
This all involves the Flying Doctor service with John Flynn, who is a Presbyterian of the extreme wing, who thought that Adam's drunken, hungover condemnation of his coloured son, Ham, was God's eternal punishment of all black people. So his aeroplanes never carried black people. Now, they don't ever let you know that. This is the problem with literal interpretation of bits and pieces of the Bible.
Well, I don't think that interpretation is justified at all, but I do understand that certain peoples, and in Africa, there were certain people too. In South Africa, there were people who took those biblical statements as justification for their racist treatment of other people.
Oh, yes.
Shocking. I think it's shocking.
Another misinterpretation of Scripture.
This drove the American problem with their racism, with their slaves from Africa, and this drove the Reformed Church in South Africa with their apartheid, because of their literal interpretation of this one bit of Scripture.
Well, that's not just a literal interpretation, that's a vast reinterpretation, extrapolation of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think they were justified in that. But are all human beings descended from one source?
No.
That is actually important.
Not.
It really is.
So where does our sinful nature come from?
Try and say that all humanity is descended about 6,000 years ago from one man and one woman. It's just completely refuted by the genetic evidence. Absolutely it is, and by the paleontological evidence, and by the historical evidence.
Are you saying they actually had different sources, so that certain human beings on the earth today, different
the species Homo sapiens evolved over about 6 million years. The modern type of Homo sapiens are the kind of species that has been around for about 150,000 years. Never came from.
Can I add?
I'm just saying.
Can Kylie, Eliza, say something, please?
I'm just saying. I was only throwing an idea in the air. I didn't need to start an argument.
Yeah.
You
didn't start it.
Well, I brought the topic back to it, so technically I did start it.
Which topic was it?
I was the person throwing an idea in the air. And
Which idea?
And brought the topic back to the concept of Adam and Eve from the question that had been previously asked.
I was going to bring that up anyway because it's important to me. So
I think I'm the one who started the argument in even mentioning evolution.
Yeah. All right. We're way past 9 o'clock. This topic has kind of stored up more volatility than any other. Are you guys okay to keep going, or you're kind of looking to get it wound up?
Actually, he was trying to say something earlier.
Sorry?
My brain's had enough of today.
Elaine, you have to unmute yourself if you want to say something.
Yep.
No, my brain fuzzes out after the strokes, and I just have a limit to what I can do.
Yeah. Okay. Elaine?
Adam and Eve had children, Cain and Abel, who married. Who did they marry?
Their sisters. Adam and Eve had
That's an old question.
Too.
Yes.
They lived for hundreds of years. They had lots of children.
Yeah. God said, "Fruitful and multiply," so they did.
The story of Cain and Abel and how that fits into Genesis 1 to 11 and how that fits into the New Testament mentions of Cain and Abel and so on in Hebrews 11, for example. That's more than we've got time to discuss this evening, but I'd love to discuss that at some stage because I think that's really pertinent and useful.
I think most of it's going to be long discussion, and I think we've probably reached the end of our thinking time.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thanks, Gordon, very much for stimulating this conversation. And I think it is right and proper that we do tackle some hard issues where there's division. And in James, it says, be quick to listen and slow to speak, slow to get angry.
Yeah.
Love is gentle, patient and kind, it's not rude, and all this sort of thing. So I think it's a kind of testing our abilities in these sort of traits that are so necessary in a Christian life.
You didn't give any advice about beating people over the head with scientific facts. You know.
Yes, the real test of Christians is when they disagree with each other.
Yeah. Another saying I've heard is, "You're never so wrong as when you are right." And so and even if you might be right about your facts, it depends on how you handle it, yeah. Whether we can handle the truth or not. Yeah. So,
thank you, Gordon.
One of the curious things, though, is that a large part of Christianity has to be wrong on this issue of evolution. However you look at it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's at least one party has to be radically wrong.
Yeah.
And maybe that there are aspects of all our beliefs that are wrong.
Yeah.
None of us has got perfect theology. Yeah. Sure otherwise.
Yeah. Well, okie dokie. Thank you for all your involvement, and thank you for the spirit in which it was conducted. And so, but at this stage, I think I'll end the meeting. That'll end the recording. So, you happy for that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Gordon.
Yeah, we'll catch up with you later.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you, Gordon.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Oh.
Still here?